Hey everyone, if you follow my Instagram, then you saw me post about my preparation for the recent WCS Fall at Montreal, and I said that I was going to do a video describing it a bit more in detail, and well, here it is. So I'm going to go over the reasons as to why I do study, then the tools that I use, and then how I organize it all together. So first of all, the why. For some people out there, it might seem really obvious as to why you would study for an event. After all, you study for a lot of things, right? Basically your whole, childhood, and then some is based off of studying for a lot of things, right? But I think there might be a bit of an underlying tone in StarCraft or esports in general, which is that if you got to that point that you're up on stage commentating, then you pretty much already know everything that you're going to know, right? And that you watch so much StarCraft or again any esport that you just have all this information in your head. And then there's also a little bit of the, well, maybe you should study, but you really shouldn't flaunt that you're studying, because then it just seems like it's a bit of a, that you're doing it just because you want to let everyone know that you're doing it. So on that last point, yeah, there might be something to, okay, you are showing off, right? And while that might be to some people inherently bad, you do a good thing, you give a bunch of money, but then you post it on Facebook, people think that's a little crass, and it kind of takes away from the charitable act. I'm just not one of those people. I mean, if you do a good thing and you want to talk about doing a good thing, then more power to you. But in this case, for studying and showing off all the stuff that you do when you study, I actually think it's a very important thing about branding, which I've talked about quite a bit on things like Pylon Show, and then even a little bit in the Tasteless podcast that may or may not have been released by this video, and other such places where I also might do a video entirely on this subject of branding in esports and whatnot on this exact YouTube. But yeah, the point is that there is actually a little bit of like, hey, I want you guys to know that I did a lot of work for this event and I didn't just show up and do nothing, because I did do a lot of work for the event and I really wanted to do very well. And while it's all good to be like your own reward is, how you feel about it, it's only a little bit, right? So there's the brutally honest, little bit of a selfish point about doing all of this studying. On to the actual, I suppose, good, altruistic, is that the right word? Things about doing the studying. For me, studying for an event or for anything basically is just a reason to go ahead and feel confident, right? Confidence is absolutely one of the top things that you need when you're up on that camera or you're up on that mic and you're talking. Without confidence, you're going to just sound a little less impactful, right? So you're less convincing, but impactful is really one of the words I want to use, because I think it's very easy, again, this goes along with branding, to just kind of be like the person, especially coming into a scene that is already so saturated with top tier commentators. So I really want to feel confident and I really want to make an impact because of that to everyone who watches. The other thing that studying does is the most obvious thing, right? Which is that it gets you more knowledge. So I think a lot of people assume that the most important thing when you're studying to be a commentator or do anything, I suppose, is your analysis, right? That's kind of the thing you see in a lot of different esports is like, well, we respect your analysts, a lot, and then maybe your play-by-play is well loved, but they also got to know the game. It's not entirely accurate. I don't want to say it's like you think you do, but you don't type thing. But there's actually, I would say, good chunk of importance placed on knowing the game, obviously. It's more about knowing the game to tell a story. So much more of what we enjoy seeing is just, friends up there having fun, especially in StarCraft 2, because that's kind of where we started is, Tastosis, just two friends having fun, talking nerdy things. And that has certainly kept true throughout even the more professional settings in WCS. We just all still want to have a slightly casual air, although not super casual anymore. But what you can do with information other than be the stick in the mud is just like, well, actually it's 18 seconds long between these and this isn't the fastest map and blah blah blah, is that you can create storylines which are so much easier for everyone to digest. Are we getting a lot of critique from people who really, really, really love StarCraft and as such really want the nitty-gritty analysis? Absolutely. And to a degree, I think a lot of people do seek some validation from those people. I mean, heck, it's nice to hear that you actually really understand a matchup. But even for those hardcore people, to listen to pure analysis for 3 days or even more, depending on an event, would probably get a little tiring. And then, of course, for newbies, they actually don't really care. What they care about is what does this mean in the whole grand context of things. So I've always looked as information as the story building element per game, per series, per bracket stage, per event, right? Those are all the stories, and even, then some, I didn't even get to mention there, that come into it, right? So if I can see that in a particular game, this build impacts the next 3 minutes this way, and the other person has to respond to that, it's not so much just like sounding smart as it is being like, well, here's the story, here's where there might be the climax, and here's where there's going to be the ramp up and the slow down and stuff like that. And then you bring it into the rest of the series. Like, well, because they did it last game, they're doing something different this game. Then we see the development of the story between the players. And as I said, on to the bracket and on to the story of the whole event, which for the last stop of WCS is almost always the WCS points. So those are the big reasons to study, in my opinion. And then there's a ton more, and it also does come down a lot to your personal preference as a commentator and as a person. Some people do a lot better not studying, right? It feels maybe more organic when they don't do as much, or they feel more nervous if they actually do more studying, because then there's suddenly a bunch of information rolling around in their mind. So as cool as it is to feel really fancy walking around with your briefcase full of all these papers and nice, organized note keeping and all that stuff, it's not the end all be all. And certainly anyone who doesn't show off this stuff or doesn't necessarily do it shouldn't be condemned. To wrap this whole section of the video up, I just want to again reiterate that it's pretty much purely about building that confidence and building that story so that you can appeal to as many people as possible, even cross genre, cross games, so on and so forth. On to the next part. So what tools do you use to study? Now, again, most of us have gone through middle, high school, college, post, college, like a bunch of different stuff. Even some of us are studying in our professions even still to take tests. Well, there's not really any tests in StarCraft, but the point is studying can still be helpful. But what do you use is always a bit different, and many of you out there probably have your own way of doing things, as again, we all learned when we went through school. I was not a very study-oriented student, actually, despite having grown into someone who actually does enjoy taking notes and making them look pretty and all that. I actually take a lot of, influence from that. I give a lot of credit to that from watching like Parks and Rec and seeing Leslie Knope do all that note keeping. But I wasn't that when I was younger. But I've kind of like grown into it. So the way that I do things nowadays is what you would expect when I have my notebook, right? So this is kind of the big main thing. Then I have a very small portable, like extra portable thing that I usually keep in my book bag when I go on like the airplane or something, because sometimes I'm listening to VODs before landing, on the airplane. There's something else to do. Montreal's not that far away from me, but if I go to Challenger, then it's a 5-hour flight. I'm gonna listen to some VODs, why not? So this could be VODs from previous challengers, or even online tournaments, or even people's personal streams where they were very on point with their analysis of their own games. Here's where things maybe get a little more detailed than what everyone else does with their note-taking, but as I've said, I've really grown into making my notes fun. I mean, there's something about being able to flip through your books and have nice bright colors and, be able to grab your attention on the more important things and stuff like that. So I definitely started collecting a lot of stationery, and my time in Korea and Japan have kind of helped add interest to that, because their stationery is amazing. But I'm not going to go ahead and nerd out of stationery, in this video anyways. But just really quick, you do have I have my sticky notes, right? Just put that somewhere, anywhere on any of the notes that I take, or even on the handouts that sometimes I print out, because it's easier than just rewriting it down. That just say a couple of things. Always nice to have. I got cute little tabs. Again, these are from Japan, I think. I'm just looking at it right now. So I got them when I was in Tokyo. And these do happen to be dogs, but preferably they're cats. Whatever. The point is, then I can go ahead and flip quickly to a section that I can, whether it's WCS points or player tips or storylines, whatever, I can quickly flip to that. Then I have my handouts. So these can be things, as I said, that I just don't want to, write down because that would be kind of a waste. I mean, printer ink, kind of expensive, but whatever. And then we have what is probably more important than that is, for instance, this is the breakdown that we're given on the first day. I also do have the WCS points that I actually pinned to my overall notebook again. And then finally, for this particular event, I did print out tongue twisters that I have from doing voice acting, studying, and stuff like that, which are very helpful. I probably should have done it before this video, for instance. You do tongue twisters, you do even just like scenes from a book or something like that, and you work on articulation, enunciation, tone, feeling, all that good stuff. And it might sound a little cheesy, but it actually does help. And then finally, for this event, again, just going with the whole confidence theme of this whole reason why I do things, is that I got a nice briefcase. I felt very fancy. I just want to point out that I did that. The other thing that I use that doesn't get highlighted when I take pictures is Evernote. So Evernote's probably the best program for taking down notes. I do wish there were some added features, but it is probably the best for what it does. I usually use Evernote to jot down build orders, which then I use on my YouTube videos, as well as recent VOD studies where I try and do quick overviews of recent VODs of players I think will be important. So pretty much all of Challenger, right? Where I just say generally what build they did, and then if I find a particular interest in a build order, I do try and note what makes build orders different than other build orders. On to the meat and potatoes, right? So the actual way that I organize things, it kind of did a brief overview when I brought out all of my materials, but this notebook, probably the notebook, I suppose, of the study, so just the main event notebook. So if you saw my Instagram post, again, I did a quick little flip through. I'll try and be a little more specific here. I do have the tournament overview, including prize pool, WCS point breakdown. Let's see here, the way that the brackets work. Very basic stuff that you would definitely know, especially if you've done previous WCS events. But just is one of those things where, if you write it down, and this is something that I didn't get to mention, but I should have, I like to write things down more than I like typing because writing does actually help you remember. Also just feels a little bit nicer, like you're actually studying. But anyways, basic stuff might seem stupidly basic, and why would you bother writing that down? But it does help me, and I've looked at a couple other more respected people in esports who do note-taking. Hosts do a lot of note-taking, especially if they do multiple games. And while it seems redundant, I mean, if someone like Red Eye jots all this stuff down, then I figured that it might be helpful for me, and I think that it is. It kind of gives a little bit more weight to things that we often don't consider, like how often do you consider that $20,000 is up for grabs, and how can we contextualize that to make it sound like a heck of a lot of money? Well, you compare it to the other prize placings, right? And then suddenly it seems like a heck of a lot. Then I have my qualified players, which I do color code as their races. I believe I tried using initially the Ligilac way of color coding them, which I think is shared by Wikipedia, but anyways. Orange for Zerg, green for Protoss, blue for Terran. Then I have my WCS points, which, is very, very important for the final stop, but can be something you can bring up in any stop, really. The first is, a little bit weirder, but even then you can bring up the fact that they had so many last year and bring it into this year. So it was a lot more important for fall. So I did write down some of the key players, which are the people who were not quite at number 8, right? And then I also had some discussions with them here, there, whatever. I was in Korea and I was talking to them online about what their personal goals were. Whatever you see on the pages as I, just open up my world to you guys, I suppose, of note keeping, is not always the very, specific things that I'm going to say or even necessarily accurate. And while they might not be accurate as in oh, I made a mistake, absolutely that happens, it is more like, it's not accurate because I keep mental notes as well, right? Someone on Twitter accurately posted that some of my WCS point calculations, the way that it's written, isn't actually what the case was. You know, anyone could have been bopped out if anyone had gotten first place, which was highly unlikely. But yeah, so saying that, you know, they only need to be at X or Y place isn't actually accurate. But what I do with the WCS points and writing them down and trying to construct, again, that storyline is that, hey, if this person were to make it here, then they'd be in a really good spot. Because if you always overanalyze and are over detailed with that, then it just kind of starts getting confusing and really bogs down, especially where you're usually talking on them, which is the analyst desk, because the desk really does not get a lot of time, right? So we kind of want to be like, we want to have the laughs, we want to have the camaraderie, and then we want to have a couple of neat points about the last game and the next game, and then also all the stuff about the overall tournament. It's a lot to fit in. And saying things like, well, if Scarlet were to get this, but then if she were to beat out by this person, and then also if another person got this point, then also there's that chance that the other person actually got first. It just gets like, you know, a little annoying even. Then I have my key players, which are the top 8s. And in the case of this year, the top 8 were the top 8 for like basically every single event. So they really and truly are key players. If you can see, I have the win rates of them, which is the form win rate, which again doesn't really matter. I'm not going to bring up the fact that they're in form. I think one of these players was like 100% versus Zerg because the last 8 Zerg they played were beaten by them. Like, it doesn't actually mean very much. But just to get a general overview of maybe what they could be feeling is their best or worst or what have you, especially if it is really, really high or really, really low. Then I have some notes on some of the players as I came along with them, right? So Neeb was called the weakest, or the king of the weakest region, I think, in the Team Liquid preview, which I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Didn't ever use it, and it is a little a little BM in a way, but I note some of those things. And then I have the win records of the main events that have happened. So sometimes I included things like Assembly or GSL vs. the World or even the Clash tournament if I thought it was pertinent, if I thought whoever they won or lost against was going to happen again in WCS Fall. Otherwise, I made sure to note what their placements were in previous WCS events and then also who they lost to or won against in those tournaments. I do have a section to potential storylines, but as you can see, it's actually even a little bit sparse. The way that we have to do storylines, again, especially with the point calculations of the final event, can't really be too clear from the get-go, and the emphasis is on those points, which aren't even really clear until the final day, and that's when you really have to drive like, okay, these people are in contention for XYZ home. So I still jotted down whenever I could, and certainly some of the big notes of this event were the new maps, the new patch. We had Time as the only Chinese representative in a very, very long time for WCS, or actually for this entire iteration of WCS. I did take the time to write down the groups. Group stage 1, not really that important, but there were some interesting groups even at the group stage 1 because we have a lot of great players that don't necessarily qualify through Challenger. Unfortunately, with the restrictions of WCS and how it has to fit into those 3 days most of the time, well, all the time actually, you can only do so much, but I do think that it's nice to include like, hey, this guy almost lost in group stage 1. Like, if they're almost lost in that group, that's suddenly like a big question mark as to the rest of his tournament performance. I have an entire section on previous stops, so I kind of wrote them small in the key players section, but then I wrote them large and very easy to see in its own section. So this section didn't get titled. I could do it now and make it clear, I suppose, but that would be cheating. But I knew what section I wanted this to be, which is also why I did this thing, right? And this is the section I was going to use and basically fill out most of the notebook if needed to quickly look up stats and previous history as well as some storyline notes on the casts that I got to do, as well as a little bit for the desks. I mean, basically the same actually between the desk and the casts, but point is, if I was told like, hey, you're gonna do this one, which sometimes was later than sooner, but anyways, then I would quickly go down to a Ligilac and I'd go for their scores, because I didn't do all of the players and their match history. So Estrella versus Hellraiser was the first one that I did. And I went ahead and jotted down their forms against each other, any history they might have had, as well as some stories of the two players to make it interesting. And that continues on for a few pages, you know, very quick notes, but just to feel especially confident for that desk segments is when we're supposed to be doing justice to the upcoming match, even though we also have so many other things to talk about. So, you know, you get up there and you have a laptop, you can look up these stats pretty instantly. I don't really have to do this at all on my own while I'm sitting in the break room, but I do just in case something happens or I get caught up doing something else, like for instance hair and makeup, which can take a long time at the beginning of the day. So I like to go ahead and do that, feel safe, and do it as quick as possible. In the back here, I actually have some notes over interesting articles that I thought might be pertinent to the tournament. So you can actually see that I did Gemini's build order, his most recent one, build of the week. I also try and frequent like all things Protoss and see what he's posted, see you know what is in the meta. And while it's a big difference because we had that new patch, I still like seeing through the eyes of a Protoss player, of which I'm a pretty poor one, right? And I do still consider that my weakest knowledge, but I really tried hard to work on it. And I thought that Gemini not only does that build order, which is really nice, I can take that and compare it to other build orders if I can, but he also does a great job of actually going over like the mentality and why it changed and why you would do things, so it's very, very helpful. And then the other side is the Terrancraft notes. Now, Terrancraft's an awesome place to go, guys. I believe if you just Google Terrancraft, you should be able to find it. Sorry if I don't have the direct link, but it is a little redundant for me. A lot of things I do already know. It is really nice to see how someone else explains the process of things, just to make sure that I'm doing it as accurately as possible, and as newbie friendly as possible as well. I do have a section for random notes in this, if this is what's closest, just alongside that little notepad I showed earlier. One of the rising complaints from the community seems to be on the subject of maps, especially the most recent maps. But I've also seen little critiques, let's say, to put it kindly, here and there of when casters use the word large or small or stuff like that. It's still nice to be able to say like, well, technically this map isn't large. It actually has, an X or Y rush distance, but it does have these other features of the map that makes it feel this way. So I tried really hard to bring in both the actual data as well as bring in the, opinions of someone who's actually playing the game. And I did try and talk to at least some of the players. It was unfortunately mostly Terran players. But yeah, over their opinions on why these maps feel like they're hard to at least run across. He actually had a lot of times being like, well, actually, hold on here. These maps all share very similar main to main, nat to nat stuff. And then you have some other nice little important notes for me anyways, like Winter's Gate, that third to third thing I brought up a few times. When I saw that was like 18 seconds, I think, yeah, I was like, oh my God, I really need to bring this up. So having that concrete knowledge and then being able to use, again, not just numbers, because numbers get really heavy and they bog everyone down, but also have the numbers with the explanation of like, well, this is how the armies will move and interact with each other, and that's why it feels how it does, was very, very helpful. I was actually very glad that I went ahead and went in to the mapmaker myself, as well as read the rush distances on Wikipedia to compare and contrast and just make sure that I got it right, and have this page open while I was casting. So one of the things I did for this particular event was actually contacted a couple of pros to get their knowledge, basically get an hour of their time and then jot down any notes they have, as well as ask them any specific questions over anything, basically. So, for instance, I talked to Drogo. He told me a lot about PvP, which was great because I, still struggle to kind of understand how that matchup is understood by the players themselves. But I didn't really get to use, unfortunately, in the event. I still know way more about PvP than I did previously. But also talk to them about like, hey, what do you think casters really need to work on or don't do correctly and stuff like that. I only got to talk to 2 pros, unfortunately, this time around, between traveling from Korea and syncing up the time zones and whatnot, but I definitely wish to do more of this in the future because it was really, really insightful. And then last for this, I do have my little sticky note where I have everything that I wanted to do, my little checklist of studying, I guess, and all the crossing off so I can feel like I did something good. Check, and then you feel good. So I hope you guys enjoyed that description of my study process. It definitely went longer than I thought it would, so my bad. Hopefully it's a little shorter after the editing, but I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to let me know so I can maybe do it again later for future events. Make sure to follow me on my Twitch, where I do a lot of the studying on my Twitch stream before the event, leading about a week leading up to any events, if you've ever been interested in watching the studying as it's happening. And then, of course, follow this YouTube channel. Thank you so much, guys. I will see you later.